The bitter winds of Vladivostok cut through the air like shards of ice, piercing everything in their path. The vast training ground of the joint military exercises between Russia, China, and Burkina Faso was blanketed in thick snow, transforming the landscape into an endless white expanse. Despite the freezing temperature that plunged well below zero, steam rose from every soldier's breath as they ran in disciplined formation across the frozen field. Artillery boomed in the distance, echoing off the surrounding mountains, while the flags of all three nations fluttered beneath towering poles, their colors stark and vivid against the pale winter sky. Amidst this organized chaos of military precision stood a tall, imposing African soldier, his posture relaxed yet somehow commanding. This was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. But today he had not come as a head of state or commanding officer. Today he stood among his soldiers as an equal, a comrade sharing their burden and their trials. He wore a simple soldier's jacket, devoid of the golden epaulets and ceremonial decorations that typically adorned a president. On his chest was only his national emblem, a golden stallion, the ancient symbol of courage that had represented his people for generations, passed down through the oral traditions of the mossy kingdoms. A Russian officer nearby observed him with evident curiosity, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Why has the president himself come to participate in these exercises?" he asked, turning to a Chinese commander standing beside him. The Chinese officer replied with a sardonic smile, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed amusement. "Perhaps in Africa they lack proper military training. Let's see what he can demonstrate here among real soldiers." But Traoré remained silent, seemingly oblivious to the murmured conversations around him. His eyes were fixed on the snowflakes falling gently to the ground, as if he had fallen into some deep contemplation, connecting with something far beyond this frozen military base. There was a stillness about him that seemed almost spiritual, as though he was preparing not just his body but his very soul for what was to come. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the center of the field. His boots left deep impressions in the fresh snow, each step measured and purposeful. The Russian officer grabbed the microphone, his voice booming across the training ground. "Now the representative from Burkina Faso will demonstrate their traditional defense arts." A wave of laughter rippled through the assembled crowd. Russian soldiers in their white winter uniforms and Chinese officers exchanged knowing glances and smirks. To them, the idea of an African soldier demonstrating traditional combat techniques seemed almost comical, perhaps something akin to tribal dancing rather than serious martial prowess. The prejudice was palpable in the air, thick as the falling snow. Traoré removed his helmet with slow, reverent movements and placed it carefully on the snow. He raised both hands toward the sky, palms open, fingers extended. His face showed perfect tranquility, as if he were engaged in prayer or meditation. Then he adjusted his stance, planting his right foot firmly into the ground, adopting a position that seemed both ancient and purposeful. The field fell silent. Even the bitter wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. Suddenly, Traoré began to move. His arms flowed outward in gentle arcs, his knees bent with practiced precision, his feet moving in perfect rhythm and synchronization. This was not merely physical movement. It was a language, a form of communication that spoke of patience, respect, and unity. Each gesture seemed to tell a story. Each shift of weight carried meaning deeper than mere combat technique. A young Russian officer whispered to his companion, barely suppressing a laugh. "This looks like some kind of dance routine." "It's not a dance," came a voice from behind them, sharp with authority. "It's a test of your arrogance." The crowd turned to see who had spoken. From the white backdrop of snow and ice emerged a striking figure, a woman with beautiful golden blonde hair, her presence commanding immediate attention. She wore a blue coat with the Russian flag emblem on her shoulder, and her bearing spoke of confidence, power, and no small amount of pride. This was Colonel Elena Petrovna, the Russian Army's renowned martial arts trainer, famous throughout the military establishment for her strictness, intelligence, and legendary arrogance. She had never been defeated in combat, and she carried that record like a crown. She smiled, but there was something cold in it, something that cut deeper than the Siberian wind. Captain Traoré, if this is your combat technique, then I'm surprised your enemies ever fall. Your movements are as soft as a poet's, not hard like a soldier's should be. Laughter erupted through the crowd like a breaking wave. The sound bounced off the snow, creating an echo chamber of mockery. But Traoré merely bowed his head slightly, his voice calm and measured when he spoke. Our land has taught us that the true meaning of strength is control, not destruction. Elena's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. Perhaps that's why your continent remained enslaved for centuries. In war, aggression wins, not gentleness, not philosophy. Traoré looked at her calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching or showing anger. Sometimes, Colonel, patience itself is the greatest aggression. A strange tension filled the air at these words. Russian officers began exchanging glances, uncertain how to interpret what they'd just heard. Elena laughed, a sound both mocking and challenging, and gestured dramatically with her hand. "Very well, Mr. President," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "If you can defeat my Russian combat technique in 3 minutes, I'll accept your words. In fact, I'll even become your servant." The words rang out across the field like a bell. The crowd erupted in laughter again, louder this time, more raucous. But Traoré's face showed neither smile nor anger, only perfect calm. A single sentence emerged from his lips, quiet but clear. "I didn't come here to win slaves. I came to demonstrate honor." The direction of the wind seemed to change at that moment. The snowflakes paused in their descent. This quiet statement transformed the field's mockery into something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. It was the moment when the world first realized that this African soldier possessed not just physical strength, but a spiritual elevation that few could match. The snow continued to fall as the crowd's noise erupted like a fountain of fire. Russian soldiers laughed and shouted, their voices carrying across the frozen expanse. Chinese officers exchanged knowing smiles, secure in their assumptions. In the midst of all this, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood quietly, like a pillar of silence in a sea of chaos. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was determination, a resolve as unshakable as mountains. Colonel Elena Petrovna took a step forward, that same arrogant smile playing on her lips, the expression of someone who has never known defeat. She raised her hand, silencing the crowd with a gesture, and spoke loudly for all to hear. "I, Colonel Elena, representative of the Russian army, challenge this African soldier. 3 minutes, just 3 minutes. If you can defeat my technique in that time, I will accept your words." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. "In fact, if you win, I'll even be willing to marry you." The words fell like a bomb. The crowd exploded with laughter, whistles, and applause. A Chinese officer laughed openly and said, "This has turned into a romantic competition." Several Russian soldiers whispered among themselves, their voices carrying on the cold air. "That African will never win. Colonel Elena is invincible. She's undefeated in over 300 matches." But Traoré showed no reaction, no effect whatsoever. He simply cleared the snow from around his boots with careful movements and said quietly, "I don't fight for marriage. I fight for honor." The words emerged with such tranquility that the crowd fell silent again, the laughter dying in their throats like extinguished flames. Elena responded with mocking laughter. "Then prepare yourself to defend your honor. Mr. President, I show no mercy in the field." Traoré nodded once. "I don't want mercy. I only want an opportunity." At that moment, the Russian commander made an announcement that echoed across the base. "The match will take place tomorrow morning at 800 hours. 3 minutes, no weapons, no quarter given." The field began to empty. Soldiers headed toward their barracks, their conversations animated with speculation and betting. The icy wind continued to blow, but there was another kind of heat in the air now. The heat that rises in the name of honor, the fire that burns when pride is challenged. Night fell over Vladivostok. The moon hid behind icy clouds, and the base's lights had been extinguished one by one. But in one corner, beneath the falling snow, Traoré stood alone in the darkness. Silence surrounded him, broken only by the sound of wind and occasionally the sound of wood striking wood as he practiced. In his hands was a wooden staff. With it, he had begun rehearsing his technique, moving through forms that had been passed down through generations of warriors in his homeland. Plant your feet in the ground. Don't rush your breathing. Let movement flow with the wind, he repeated to himself, as if bringing his teacher's voice back to life in this foreign land. The snowflakes danced around him in the darkness, but he saw creativity in their patterns, saw lessons in their chaos. With each movement, he brought his heartbeat under control, centering himself in preparation for the trial ahead. After some time, his comrade Major Adris approached through the snow. "Mr. President, you're still awake?" Traoré smiled faintly. When the heart finds peace in the snow, sleep becomes unnecessary. Adris asked with concern evident in his voice. "You know that woman is very powerful. Russian Sambo isn't just fighting. It's a killing technique, designed for warfare and survival," Traoré said softly, looking up at the snow-covered sky. "I'm not going to kill her. I'm going to teach her that strength doesn't only mean attack. Restraint is also a weapon, perhaps the most powerful weapon of all." A fierce gust of wind came then, covering both men's footprints in the snow, erasing all trace of their presence. Adris quietly saluted and walked away into the darkness, leaving Traoré alone with his thoughts and his practice. Traoré knelt on the ground, placed his hands on his chest, and looked toward the sky. "Oh Allah," he whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Tomorrow I'm not going to defeat anyone. I'm only going to show the world that dignity never loses, even when the body falls." Dawn was approaching. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of the call to prayer, perhaps from a Russian mosque that served the Muslim community in Vladivostok. Traoré closed his eyes and smiled softly. 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes and the world will see that restraint is more dangerous than force, that patience is stronger than aggression. His footprints in the snow wrote a new determination, a resolve that existed neither for power nor for love, but for that honor which makes every human being truly human. The night sky over Vladivostok was as white as the snow itself, clouds reflecting the faint light of the hidden moon. The military base had fallen into deep silence. Only the low rumble of generators and the distant whisper of wind could be heard across the frozen expanse. The field where laughter and mockery had echoed during the day now lay empty and still, snow continuing to fall as if nature itself had retreated into contemplation. But in the northern section of the base, one figure remained awake and active. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood outside his tent, wooden staff in hand, quietly practicing. Every movement carried softness, yet every shift held hidden power. The snowflakes swirled around him as if following the rhythm of his motions, as if even the elements recognized something sacred in his preparation. Each breath coordinated perfectly with his body's movements. This was his training. This was his prayer. This was his meditation. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow came from behind him. The sound of boots on snow was clear in the silent night. He stopped, turned, and saw Colonel Elena Petrovna standing there in the darkness. She wore a long brown coat over her shoulders, her face pale from the cold, but her eyes still held that sharp intensity, that competitive fire. "Still awake, Mr. Traoré?" she said in English, her accent crisp and precise. "Sleep is for weak hearts, Colonel. Tomorrow's day is important." Elena smiled slightly, an expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Important for you, perhaps. For me, it's just another exercise. I win dozens of such matches every week. Your style is beautiful, I'll admit, but on the field, beauty doesn't matter. Only strategy and strength," Traoré replied calmly, his voice steady. "My land has taught me that strategy and beauty are two names for the same thing. If strength lacks patience, it becomes destruction. And if beauty lacks purpose, it becomes deception." Elena fell silent for a moment, something in his words catching her off guard. She stepped forward, coming closer until she stood directly before him, close enough that he could see the uncertainty flickering behind her confident facade. "You speak in philosophies, Mr. President, but on the field, perspectives don't matter. The body speaks. Tomorrow, when I throw you to the ground, Your words won't help you, Traoré said gently, meeting her eyes. If I fall, I'll fall with honor, Colonel. You perhaps don't understand. Falling to the ground isn't defeat for us. It's a lesson. Every fall teaches us something about balance, about humility, about rising again. Curiosity flickered in Elena's eyes. You're a strange man. You have no fear. Do you know how fast I strike? Do you understand that I've broken bones, that I've sent trained soldiers to hospitals? Traoré smiled, and there was something genuinely warm in it. One who has control over himself doesn't fear anyone's strikes. Fear comes from lack of preparation, from ego, from the desire to win rather than to learn. A gust of wind passed between them. Snowflakes landed on both their faces, melting instantly from the warmth of their skin. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the distant howl of wind across the frozen landscape. Elena spoke again, and this time her voice held genuine puzzlement. Your country is small. Your army is weak by global standards. But your words carry strength. This contradiction confuses me. How can you speak with such confidence when by every metric you should be humble before powers like Russia? Traoré answered, and his voice carried the weight of history, of ancestors, of a land that had seen empires rise and fall. Strength isn't measured by the number of soldiers or the size of territories. It's measured by the purity of intention. My country is small, but its soul is vast. We're not owners of the land. We're protectors of it. We don't seek to conquer. We seek to preserve. That is our strength. Elena looked away, perhaps hearing something in his voice that she'd never heard before. Not from any African soldier, not from anyone she'd faced in combat. She said, her voice slightly softer, You know, tomorrow's match isn't without danger for you. I won't hold back. I want to throw you down so the world can see that your patience, your peace, is all just pretense, just weakness disguised as philosophy. Traoré bowed his head slightly. If you throw me down, you'll have won the match. But if I teach you honor, you'll have won something far greater. In both scenarios, the victory will be yours, Colonel. Hearing this, Elena's face showed confusion, perhaps even the beginning of something like respect. She turned and began walking away, her boots crunching in the snow. But as she departed, her steps didn't carry that same certainty they'd had before. For the first time, she found herself wondering, does only the body fight in the field, or does the heart play a role as well? The snow intensified. Traoré looked up at the sky, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Tomorrow, in just 3 minutes, I'll show her what the power of patience truly means. In the distance, Elena's shadow disappeared among the lights, and a slight smile came to Traoré's lips. Tomorrow won't be just a fight. Tomorrow, a perspective will come alive. A truth will be revealed. The morning in Vladivostok was frozen but golden. Snowflakes sparkled in the weak sunlight, as if someone had spread a blanket of diamonds across the field. In the center of the base, that same vast training ground was being prepared for today's historic match, a contest between an African president and a Russian colonel that had become the talk of 3 nations. Soldiers from Russia, China, and other countries gathered from different corners of the base. Some were recording videos on their mobile phones, already imagining the viral footage. Others were placing bets, most confident that Colonel Elena would defeat him within the first minute. A Chinese camp officer laughed and said to his companions, "This African president will break his bones along with his pride today. He doesn't understand what real combat means." But the Burkina Faso soldiers remained silent, their silence more powerful than any words. In their eyes was not fear but pride. They knew their captain wasn't just a warrior. He was the very soul of their nation, the embodiment of their ancestors' courage and wisdom. At that moment, on the horizon, the sun's golden streak appeared. Through the snow emerged a figure, walking slowly but with purpose toward the center of the field. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wore a black uniform with a red belt, and on his face was that same tranquility, the quiet that comes before a storm. Each step left a distinct mark in the snow, strong, straight, and solid. These were not the footsteps of someone going to battle, but of someone going to teach a lesson. a Russian officer said with barely concealed laughter. "Look at this! Has the president come to do yoga or to fight?" But no answer came, because Traoré had reached the center of the field. He knelt down, touched the snow with his hand in a gesture of respect, and said softly, "O Earth, today I haven't come to throw someone down upon you. I've only come to show that the roots of patience lie within you." At that moment, an announcement echoed from the other side. "Colonel Elena Petrovna is approaching." Noise erupted around the field's perimeter as if a famous performer were arriving. Elena walked forward in a blue uniform, her head held high, her face showing complete confidence. Russian officers surrounded her like an honor guard. But her eyes were fixed on only one place, on Traoré. She approached, stopped a few feet away, and spoke in a mocking tone. "Captain Traoré, perhaps the sun rises early in your country, but today might prove to be your last sunrise. At least as a man with an intact reputation," Traoré replied with complete calm, his voice carrying across the field. "One who closes their eyes to the sunlight becomes a slave to darkness. I didn't come to see darkness. I came to show light." A faint smile appeared on Elena's lips, but somewhere inside, an unfamiliar restlessness was growing. A nearby Russian general clapped his hands, his voice booming. "Friends, prepare yourselves. Today will be remembered in Vladivostok's history." Traoré's comrade, Major Adris, approached and gently placed his hand on his shoulder. "Mr. President, remember, you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every soldier in Burkina Faso, for every person who has ever been underestimated because of where they were born." Traoré smiled and replied, "I'm not going to fight, Adris. I'm going to teach. They'll understand that Africa's land doesn't survive on iron alone, but on honor. That is our true strength, our inheritance." Tears came to Adris's eyes. "May Allah grant you success, sir." "Success belongs to those who kill the fear within themselves," Traoré said, looking toward the sky. He placed both hands on his chest and took a deep breath. Elena put on her gloves and planted her feet firmly. Tension began mounting in the air, palpable and electric. Behind the distant mountains, the sun fully emerged, and in its light, two human shadows stood face to face, one representing the power of Russia, the other the patience of Africa, a 3-minute battle that to the world was merely a match. But to these two represented a test of honor and perspective, of philosophy and practice, of the old ways and the new. The cold wind had intensified across Vladivostok's vast field, but the crowd's breathing seemed to have stopped entirely. Russian, Chinese, and Burkina Faso soldiers stood in rows, their attention absolute. Cameras had been turned on, recording every moment, and the flags of all three nations fluttered in the icy wind, their colors vivid against the white landscape. This morning was no longer ordinary. It had become a test of two different philosophies of strength. On one side stood Colonel Elena Petrovna in her blue uniform, ready for combat. On her face was that same confidence, that same pride born from years of training and an undefeated record. Her boots were planted firmly on the ground, her eyes gleaming with the light of combat, her breathing controlled despite the freezing temperature. On the other side stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré in his black uniform. His face was peaceful, his eyes lowered toward the ground. He hadn't come like a conqueror, but like a dervish, a seeker of truth through action. Major Adris whispered softly, "Mr. President, remember, these spectators want to see you as weak. Show them that honor is a greater weapon than victory." Traoré smiled and said, "No one will lose today, Adris, because today, the meaning of strength is going to change." Russia's chief instructor grabbed the microphone and announced, "The match will begin now. 3 minutes. No weapons, no mercy. Time starts now." A long whistle pierced the air. Elena immediately moved forward, taking the traditional sambo position. Her knees were half bent, shoulders straight, hands ready like a predator prepared to strike. Her eyes moved over Traoré's body like a hawk, studying its prey, looking for weaknesses, for openings. "Come on, Captain," she said in a loud voice that carried across the field. But Traoré didn't move. He remained perfectly still, calm. He simply opened his hands from his chest and began moving slowly in a circular pattern, a defensive stance. Elena mocked him with laughter. "Have you come to dance?" "No," Traoré said quietly. "I've come to show you that silence itself is defense." In the next moment, Elena attacked. Her boots struck the snow with force as she closed the distance between them in 2 powerful steps. With a swift motion, she grabbed his arm and attempted a classic hip throw, a technique she'd used successfully hundreds of times. But at that precise moment, Traoré shifted his body's weight. Like water finding its own path, he flowed out of her grip. Elena's arms closed on empty air, and she stumbled backward slightly. A collective gasp came from the spectators. The Russian general raised his eyebrows. The Chinese officer whispered, "That was coincidence. The next strike will bring him down." Elena recovered quickly, grinding her teeth in frustration. She lunged again, this time aiming directly at his knees with a single-leg takedown, a move designed to be impossible to escape. But Traoré rotated his step, placed both hands on her shoulders, and used his elbow to redirect the pressure. Elena's balance broke. She spun and fell toward the ground, but Traoré extended his hand and caught her, preventing her head from hitting the frozen earth. The crowd fell into shocked silence. The snowflakes seemed to pause in midair. Traoré said softly, "I'm not your opponent. I'm a mirror of your strength." Elena looked at him, her breathing heavy, her face flushed. But in her eyes was surprise rather than anger. "Why won't you throw me down? You had the perfect opportunity." "Because I want to show that maintaining control is a greater achievement than causing someone to fall. Victory without honor is hollow, Colonel." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Russian officers' faces became serious, their initial amusement evaporating like morning mist. Elena stood up again. This time, her face showed not mockery but determination mixed with growing frustration. "You think you're a philosopher? Remember, this is a field of combat. Here, those who show mercy die, and those who maintain control survive." "Survival and honor are not enemies," Traoré said quietly. "They're partners, 2 sides of the same truth." Elena attacked for the 3rd time, putting all her strength into it. Snow flew as their bodies moved, but Traoré read her movements perfectly. In one fluid motion, he caught her arm and with a soft but precise movement, turned her pressure against herself. Elena spun in a complete circle and would have crashed hard to the ground. But before impact, she felt herself being supported, guided gently down rather than thrown violently. She realized in that instant, this wasn't defeat. This was a lesson, delivered with compassion rather than cruelty. The crowd fell into complete silence. The first minute had passed. Snow continued melting on the ground from their body heat, but the cold of honor remained in the air, sharp and clear and undeniable. Around the field's perimeter, snowflakes now settled on the ground rather than floating in the air. The cold wind carried with it a tension that made everyone's eyes focus on just 2 people. On one side stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's pride, standing with deep inner peace. On the other was Colonel Elena Petrovna, Russia's arrogant Sambo master, whose face now showed uncertainty for perhaps the first time in her decorated career. The first minute had passed, but that single minute had changed the entire atmosphere of the field. The crowd that had been laughing earlier was now serious, reverent even. Even placing feet in the snow felt like a sin, as if any sound might disturb this sacred silence. Elena took a deep breath, gritted her teeth, and moved forward. "Your soft steps won't save you, Traoré. I'm going to make you taste the ground." Traoré's face held that same smile, as if he'd heard all this before, as if he understood the script that was unfolding. "Colonel, one shouldn't fear the ground. It's every warrior's first and last teacher. We come from Earth and return to it. There's no shame in that connection." Elena, frustrated, launched a fast strike. She moved like lightning, grabbing his shoulder and attempting to throw him down with a powerful jerk. But Traoré changed the angle of his body and slipped from her hands, stepping back 2 paces with perfect balance. For a moment, their eyes met. Elena's breathing heavy and fast, Traoré's still measured and calm. "This is your game. Just keep avoiding me!" Elena said angrily, sweat beginning to form despite the freezing temperature. No, this is patience, Traoré replied evenly. When you understand yourself, the meaning of strikes will change. You'll see that combat isn't about defeating others, it's about mastering oneself. These words pierced her heart like thorns. Elena yanked off her cap and threw it onto the snow, her face now showing pure determination. Then watch where my patience takes you. She rushed forward aggressively, ducking low to strike at his legs, then suddenly rising to attempt a shoulder lock. Traoré rotated his arm in a fraction of a second, broke her grip, and spun behind her. Holding her arm, he spoke. The meaning of strength isn't holding on, it's learning when to let go. If you learn to release control, you'll become truly invincible. Elena's face changed color. Did you come to lecture me or to fight? She demanded, spinning around angrily. I came to teach, because the true winner is the one who recognizes themselves, who understands their own nature. At the middle of the second minute, Elena played a dangerous move. She ducked, struck at his leg, and spun to wrap her arm around his neck, a dangerous chokehold that had ended many of her previous matches. The spectators held their breath. Russian officers began smiling confidently. Now the African president is finished, someone whispered, but Traoré immediately lowered his center of gravity, planted his knees on the ground, and used his elbow to reduce the pressure on his arm. Suddenly, he shifted his weight and used Elena's own strength to reverse the move. She found herself falling toward the ground, but before she could be injured, Traoré gently supported her shoulder, cushioning her fall. Snow flew around them in clouds. The spectators were utterly silent, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Traoré said softly, his voice carrying across the hushed field. Look, I saved you from falling because a true opponent isn't one who throws down. It's one who catches the falling. Strength without compassion is merely violence. Elena's lips began trembling. She stood up angrily. You're humiliating me, she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. Traoré replied in a calm tone that somehow cut deeper than any shout. I'm giving you honor. But you're perceiving it as humiliation. This difference teaches us that strength doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. Your honor isn't diminished by being helped, it's enhanced. But you must have eyes to see it, the second minute concluded. There was no laughter in the crowd, no applause. Only the snowflakes hanging in the air, as if they too were contemplating this strange match where strikes were fewer than lessons, where combat had transformed into something else entirely, perhaps into teaching, perhaps into a form of love. Elena looked at him once more, but now her face showed only confusion mixed with the beginnings of understanding. Traoré raised his eyes toward the sky and whispered, when combat begins to teach, that's when the heart is winning. The second minute was over. Only the final 60 seconds remained, and in those moments, the world would see a conclusion that defied all expectations. Vladivostok's frozen field had completed its second minute, but in the hearts of every person present, a strange, heavy silence had descended, a silence more profound than any they'd experienced before. Russian officers who had been laughing and making bets earlier now stared at their boots. Chinese soldiers who had come in a mocking mood had turned off their phone cameras and stood with arms crossed, their expressions thoughtful. And the Burkina Faso soldiers stood with chests puffed out proudly, as if their captain had become not just a soldier, but the very soul of their land made manifest. Colonel Elena Petrovna's breathing was labored now. Sweat on her forehead mixed with snow, glistening like pearls in the morning light. She paused for a moment, then shouted, "This is a competition! You have no fear!" Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood quietly, eyes lowered, hands folded across his chest. His face showed peace, but that peace had itself become a form of power, undeniable and absolute. "Colonel," he said softly, "you're no longer fighting. You're running from yourself. The enemy you face isn't me. It's something within you that you haven't wanted to confront." Elena's face flushed red with anger, and perhaps something else. Recognition? "I don't run from anyone. I win in combat, not in philosophy," she shouted. "Then prove that you have strength inside you," Traoré said calmly. "Real strength isn't what defeats an enemy. Real strength is what controls one's own anger, one's own pride. This statement struck Elena's heart like a naked sword. She screamed in rage, grabbed his shoulders with both hands, and pushed with all her strength. Traoré didn't resist, he simply changed his body's angle. Elena's balance broke from her own force. She stumbled and fell to her knees on the frozen ground. A long collective sigh rose from the spectators. Russian officers' faces turned pale. This was impossible. Colonel Elena on her knees before an African soldier who hadn't even struck her? Elena placed her hands on the snow, steadied herself, and immediately stood up. But in her eyes now was only stubbornness, not honor, only the desperate desire to win at any cost. Dignity be damned. Traoré stepped forward and extended his hand. "Rise, Colonel." "You haven't truly fallen." Elena slapped his hand away violently. "I don't need your sympathy." She spat. "This isn't sympathy, it's respect," Traoré said quietly. "You're fighting bravely, but your enemy isn't me. It's inside you. It's the pride that blinds every warrior who forgets why they fight." "Inside me?" Elena's voice wavered. "Yes. Inside you is the arrogance that blinds every soldier eventually. You want to win this fight to show the world something, but you'll lose yourself in the process. Victory without self-knowledge is hollow, Colonel. It's a painted mask over an empty face." Elena gritted her teeth. "You talk too much." "I don't talk," Traoré responded. "I hold up a mirror. What you see reflected isn't me, it's yourself. And mirrors don't lie, Colonel. They reveal truth whether we want to see it or not." She rushed forward once more, her strikes faster now, more desperate. She attempted a leg sweep, then a hip throw, her techniques perfect in form but increasingly frantic in execution. But Traoré deflected each one, changing her direction, transforming her pressure into flow. With every movement, snow flew in clouds, creating white circles in the air. And everyone watched in amazement as an African soldier defeated Russian combat techniques on their own ground, not with strength, but with patience, not with violence, but with wisdom. Now 2 minutes and 25 seconds had passed. Elena's arms were tired, her breathing ragged and desperate. She looked into Traoré's eyes for a moment. Those eyes that had seemed like a challenge before now seemed to weaken her heart, to dissolve her certainty. For the first time, she was thinking, is real strength really about defeating others or about protecting them? "Colonel, you're feeling it now, aren't you?" Traoré asked gently. Elena shook her head, but the gesture lacked conviction. "That your strikes haven't weakened, but the reason for fighting has disappeared from your heart? You're no longer fighting me. You're fighting what you thought you believed about yourself." Elena stepped back and took a deep breath, her chest heaving. Perhaps you're right. But I won't admit defeat," she said, though her voice had lost its edge. "Defeat and lessons are different things, Colonel. Right now, you're close to learning something precious, something that will make you stronger than any victory could." The final 30 seconds remained. Tension mounted again in the crowd, the air electric with anticipation. Elena moved forward one last time, but her steps no longer carried that same revolutionary energy, that same certainty. Traoré caught her hand mid-strike, knelt to rise from the snow, and said with profound gentleness, "Your fight is over. Now fight against your own pride. That's the real battle, the one that matters." For one suspended moment, everything stopped. Snow, breath, time, all frozen in place. Elena looked at his face where there was no pride, no gloating, only seriousness, only the desire to teach. And in that moment, something inside her broke, not with a sound, but with a feeling like ice cracking beneath the surface of a frozen lake. Snowfall over Vladivostok's field had intensified. But it wasn't just snow falling now. Time itself seemed to have frozen solid. 2 minutes and 30 seconds had elapsed. Only 30 seconds remained. But in these few remaining moments, the eyes of the world were fixed on a scene that seemed more like worship than warfare, more like meditation than combat. Captain Ibrahim Traoré still stood calmly, his breathing light but balanced, controlled. In his eyes was no fear, only a light, as if he knew that the final moment was approaching, the culmination of everything he'd come to demonstrate. On the other side, Colonel Elena Petrovna was exhausted. Her blue uniform was soaked with snow and sweat. Her hair stuck to her forehead, the strands dark with moisture, and the veins in her arms bulged with tension and fatigue. But inside her, that burning determination hadn't extinguished, the final flame of pride that must strike one last time before accepting defeat, the death throes of ego. Elena took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She planted her feet firmly on the ground and rushed forward with speed born of desperation. The crowd collectively leaned in, sensing the climax approaching. "Now she'll make her final attack," a Russian general shouted, unable to contain himself. Elena lunged at Traoré, grabbing his right arm in a flash. She spun into position for a shoulder throw, a move she'd executed flawlessly thousands of times. But this time, Traoré didn't try to escape or block the strike. Instead, he allowed himself to move with her flow, to become part of her motion rather than resist it. Suddenly, he rotated his arm, changed the direction of his steps, and with a soft but precise movement, returned her own strength back upon her, not with violence, but with the gentle inevitability of water flowing downhill. The spectators gasped as one. Elena's balance shattered completely. For one suspended moment, her legs were in the air, and in the next instant, she was falling toward the snow. But not hard, not violently. Traoré had knelt, catching her shoulder to ensure her head wouldn't strike the frozen ground. The whistle blew, piercing the air like a knife. 3 minutes complete. The entire field fell silent for several heartbeats that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then a tremendous roar erupted. Russian, Chinese, and Burkina Faso soldiers all stood up simultaneously. Some applauded, others stared at each other in disbelief, trying to process what they'd witnessed. A Russian officer said quietly, almost reverently, "That wasn't a fight. That was a lesson in humanity." Elena sat on the ground, her breathing heavy and labored, but on her face was no longer anger, only wonder mixed with the beginning of understanding. She slowly raised her head. Traoré stood before her, hands folded across his chest, that same peace on his face, that same dignity radiating from his very being. "You won," Elena said quietly, her voice barely audible. 2 minutes and 48 seconds. Traoré smiled gently and replied, "I didn't win, Colonel. Patience won. Compassion won. Understanding won. I was merely its instrument." Hearing this, Elena's lips began to tremble uncontrollably. "You didn't let me fall even though you could have." "Why? Why show mercy to someone who showed you none?" "Because I wanted you to fall into understanding, not into destruction." "Falling and breaking are different things, Colonel. One can learn from a fall. One cannot learn from being broken, only from being helped to rise again." The spectators fell completely silent. This statement became a lesson not just for her, but for every soldier present, for everyone watching who had ever confused victory with honor. Traoré knelt slowly and extended his hand with infinite gentleness. "Rise, you're not my defeated opponent. You've become worthy of being my student if you choose to learn what I have to teach." Elena extended her trembling hand. She rose unsteadily, but on her face, that arrogance had transformed entirely into humility, that pride into something softer, more human. The crowd erupted with thunderous applause that echoed off the surrounding mountains. A Russian general grabbed the microphone and announced, his voice thick with emotion, "This is the first time a non-Russian has defeated our colonel, and he did it without a single violent strike. This is unprecedented in our history." Traoré immediately raised his hand, quieting the crowd. "I didn't defeat anyone. I returned honor, to her, to myself, to all of us. There are no losers here today, only learners." Elena lowered her eyes, and from her lips came a whisper that carried across the silent field. "I thought you were weak, but you've proven that patience is the most powerful weapon of all. You've shown me that real strength isn't about dominating others, it's about mastering oneself first." Traoré said, his voice carrying the wisdom of ages. "Strength ends where compassion begins, and compassion is born where the heart is alive. A dead heart can only destroy. A living heart can create, protect, and teach." The spectators were now chanting, Captain Traoré! Captain Traoré! Burkina Faso soldiers embraced each other, tears of pride streaming down their faces. Russian soldiers stood at attention, bowing their heads in respect. A respect earned not through domination, but through demonstration of something higher, something that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. Elena looked at him one final time. In her eyes was gratitude, deep and genuine. But in her heart was a wound inflicted by pride but healed through patience. She had learned that being helped to stand is not humiliation, but the highest form of respect one warrior can show another. Now this battle had ended. But a new struggle had just begun. Elena's internal battle against her own ego, her own need to dominate rather than to understand. After the whistle blew, a roar rose in the snowy field that perhaps Vladivostok's cold winds had never heard before. Russian, Chinese, and Burkina Faso soldiers all stood up simultaneously. Surprise was on every face, pride in every gaze. But amid this noise, there was also one heart that was breaking. Drowning in silence, the heart of Colonel Elena Petrovna. She stood on the snow, the woman who in her country was considered a symbol of pride, mastery, and invincibility. But now her feet were unsteady, wobbling like a newborn learning to walk. Before her stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had not given her defeat but had exposed the war within herself, the conflict between who she thought she was and who she truly could become. Elena's lips trembled violently. She looked toward the spectators. Those Russian officers who once praised her to the heavens now averted their eyes, unable to meet her gaze. Chinese soldiers who had been laughing and betting now whispered among themselves. Their earlier mockery turned to uncomfortable silence. And the Burkina Faso soldiers stood with heads raised, smiling with pride that transcended national borders, pride in witnessing something profound and transformative. Traoré stepped forward. His voice was deep but soft, carrying across the field like a warm breeze in winter. Colonel, your strikes were strong, but your heart was harder than your strikes. Now that you've allowed your heart to soften, you've truly won. Elena took a step back, her voice breaking. No, you don't understand. I've seen defeat before everyone's eyes. A woman, a Russian officer, and you. Her voice cracked completely. Traoré immediately interrupted, his tone firm but compassionate. I've given you honor. Supporting you before you fell isn't disrespect. It's the highest respect one warrior can show another. Tears began falling on the snow from Elena's eyes, each one carrying years of accumulated pride, of victories built on the suffering of others, of a strength that had never known gentleness. That face, which had always been hard as steel, was now crumbling, revealing the vulnerable human beneath the warrior's mask. I thought you were weak, she said through her tears. Your technique seemed like a joke to me. But you've shown me that patience is more dangerous than strength, that compassion is more powerful than victory. Traoré smiled gently, and there was no triumph in it, only understanding. Then learn, Colonel. Patience is that weapon which wins hearts, not territories. It conquers souls, not bodies. The spectators were now capturing every moment on camera, recording this unprecedented scene. Russian media reporters grabbed their microphones and rushed closer. One pushed forward and demanded, Colonel Elena, do you truly accept defeat? Elena's breath caught in her throat. The spectators' eyes bore into her like physical weight. Inside her, a war erupted more violent than any physical combat, her mind telling her to protect her dignity, her reputation, her undefeated record. But her heart was saying something different, whispering that truth matters more than pride, that growth requires the death of ego. Suddenly she shouted, her voice raw with emotion, No, I didn't lose! The crowd fell silent, shocked by the outburst. This was just coincidence, she continued, her voice rising hysterically. He read my strike, that's all. Just that, it means nothing! Traoré gave no response. He only looked at her with eyes that cut deeper than any blade, eyes full of sadness, of disappointment, but also of continued compassion. Elena's hands began shaking uncontrollably. She turned toward the spectators, her voice desperate now. You all saw it, right? He was afraid to throw me down. He showed mercy. Mercy! She screamed the word like an accusation. As she said this, her voice shattered completely, breaking like ice under too much weight. In the snowy field, that scream echoed along with the crumbling edifice of her pride. The collapse of the identity she'd built over decades, Traoré said quietly, but his words carried to every ear present. Mercy isn't weakness, Colonel. It's that strength which makes a human truly human, which separates us from animals who know only violence. Emptiness appeared in Elena's eyes for one long moment, a void where certainty had once lived. Then suddenly she stepped backwards, stumbling slightly. I don't want to hear your philosophical words. You've humiliated me before these people. She grabbed her blue belt from where it had fallen and threw it violently on the ground, then turned and ran. Snowflakes flew up behind her as she fled, creating a white wake. Camera flashes lit up the scene like lightning, but she didn't look back. She just ran, her voice echoing across the field one final time. I will never call mercy a victory. Never! Traoré didn't move from his spot. He simply looked toward the sky, his breath visible in the cold air, and spoke softly. Sometimes a person must pass through their own defeat to find themselves. The journey from pride to humility is the longest journey any warrior makes, and the most important. The Burkina Faso soldiers quietly saluted, their gestures full of respect and understanding. In the air, only one truth remained, crystallized like the snow around them. The moment when pride fell to the ground and patience won humanity itself. The sun had fully risen now over Vladivostok, its golden light spreading across the white landscape like liquid honey. The crowd began to disperse slowly, soldiers returning to their duties but walking differently now, more thoughtfully, more quietly. The chatter that would normally follow such an event was muted, replaced by contemplative silence. Major Adris approached Traoré, his eyes red-rimmed with emotion. Sir, you've done something today that will be remembered for generations. You've shown the world that Africa's strength doesn't come from weapons or numbers, but from something deeper, from the soul. Traoré placed his hand on Adris's shoulder. I only showed what our ancestors have always known, what our land has always taught us. Strength without wisdom is destruction. Power without compassion is tyranny. Today wasn't about defeating Colonel Elena. It was about reminding everyone, including ourselves, of what makes us truly human. A group of Russian soldiers approached hesitantly, their earlier mockery completely absent. The senior among them, a grizzled veteran with gray hair and weathered features, stepped forward and saluted formally. Captain Traoré, he said in heavily accented English, I fought in many wars. I saw many strong fighters. But today I saw something different. I saw, teacher, you teach us that enemy is not always person in front of us. Sometimes enemy is inside us, our pride, our anger, our need to always win. Traoré returned the salute with equal respect. Every soldier is a teacher and every teacher is a student. We learn from each other even in conflict, especially in conflict. That's what makes us brothers, not enemies. The Russian soldier's eyes glistened with unexpected tears. He nodded, unable to speak further, and walked away with his comrades, their conversation hushed and serious. From the Chinese contingent, an officer approached as well. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes. He bowed slightly in the traditional manner and spoke in perfect English. Captain Traoré, I studied martial arts since childhood. My masters taught me that true kung fu is not about fighting, it's about harmony. Today, you demonstrated this principle better than any master I've known. You turned her strength into flow, her aggression into learning. This is Wu Wei, action through non-action. You understand Tao better than many Chinese warriors. Traoré bowed in return, respecting the Chinese officer's tradition. All true martial arts come from the same source, the understanding that we are all connected, that violence against another is violence against ourselves. Your masters were wise. I'm honored to have demonstrated principles they've taught for thousands of years. As the morning progressed, Traoré walked slowly back toward the Burkina Faso barracks, his boots leaving deep impressions in the fresh snow. Behind him, the field where the match had occurred looked peaceful now, serene. as if nothing extraordinary had happened there, just an empty space of white, unmarked and quiet. But something had changed, something invisible but profound. Every person who had witnessed those 3 minutes had been altered in some way, had seen a possibility they hadn't known existed, that strength could be gentle, that victory could be kind, that teaching could be more powerful than defeating. Inside his tent, Traoré knelt on the ground and prayed, his forehead touching the cold floor as he whispered thanks to Allah for the opportunity to demonstrate these principles, for the strength to show restraint, for the wisdom to teach rather than conquer. When he finished, he sat cross-legged and pulled out a small, worn notebook from his pack, a journal he'd kept since his youth, filled with thoughts, lessons, and observations. He wrote slowly, carefully, in French. "Today I fought without fighting. I won without defeating. I taught without speaking many words. Colonel Elena came to the field with pride and left with a seed of understanding. Whether that seed grows is not for me to decide. I can only plant it. This is the way of the teacher, the way of the warrior who has transcended the need for victory. I think of my ancestors, those who resisted colonization not always with weapons but with dignity, with refusal to be broken in spirit even when broken in body. They taught me that our greatest weapon is not violence but the ability to maintain our humanity even when others try to take it from us. Today, I honored them. Today, I showed the world that Africa's strength has always been there, not in matching Europe's weapons or Asia's armies, but in remembering what it means to be human when others have forgotten. Inshallah, this lesson will echo beyond this frozen field." He closed the notebook and looked out through the tent flap at the white landscape beyond, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the flags still fluttering in the wind. Russia, China, Burkina Faso, all together, all separate, all human. 3 days later, as the joint exercises concluded and the delegations prepared to return to their respective countries, a small package was delivered to Captain Traoré's tent. Inside was a handwritten letter on official Russian military stationery. The handwriting elegant but showing signs of having been written with a trembling hand. "Captain Traoré, I write this letter 3 days after our match. After 3 days of not sleeping, of thinking, of trying to understand what happened on that field. I ran away like a coward, screaming denial, because I couldn't face what you showed me about myself. For 20 years, I've built my identity on being undefeated, on being the strongest, on never showing weakness. I thought mercy was weakness. I thought compassion was failure. I thought that to be strong meant to dominate, to conquer, to break those who challenged me. You showed me something different. You could have thrown me hard onto the snow. I know this now after reviewing the video footage dozens of times. You had at least 5 moments where you could have broken my arm, dislocated my shoulder, or caused me serious injury. But you didn't. And at first I saw this as insult, as if you didn't consider me worthy of your full strength. But now I understand. You were showing me full strength, just a kind I'd never encountered before. The strength to restrain oneself, to protect even in combat, to teach even while defending. This is harder than defeating an opponent. This requires more control, more discipline, more true mastery. I am ashamed of how I reacted. I am ashamed that I denied what everyone saw. But I am also grateful because you planted something in me that day, a question I'd never asked myself. What am I fighting for? Is it just to prove I'm stronger, or is there something more? I request if you would honor me to visit Burkina Faso someday. I want to learn your ways, to understand this philosophy that made you more powerful than my technique, that made your patience stronger than my aggression. I want to become a student of what you demonstrated. I am sorry for my words, my mockery, my pride. You gave me honor when I gave you contempt. You gave me mercy when I promised you defeat. You are a true warrior, the kind I aspire to become. With deepest respect and gratitude, Colonel Elena Petrovna. Traoré read the letter twice, slowly, carefully. Then he smiled, not with triumph, but with the joy of a teacher whose student has finally understood the lesson. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote a response in his clear, careful script. Colonel Elena, your letter honors me more than any victory could. What you call shame, I call courage. The courage to admit you were wrong, to be vulnerable, to seek growth over preservation of ego. This takes greater strength than any physical combat. You are always welcome in Burkina Faso. We have much to teach each other. Your technique is superior to mine in many ways. You have discipline, training, and mastery I respect deeply. But perhaps I can share with you the philosophy that guides that technique, the purpose that makes strength meaningful rather than merely powerful. Remember? You didn't lose that day. You learned. And learning is the beginning of wisdom, which is the beginning of true strength. The path from pride to humility is the warrior's greatest journey. You have taken the first step. This is cause for celebration, not shame. Come when you are ready. Our doors are open. Our land is poor in resources, but rich in spirit. We will welcome you as sister, as student, as fellow seeker of truth. With honor and anticipation of our next meeting, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, he sealed the letter and gave it to Major Adres to deliver to the Russian delegation before they departed. That evening, as the sun set over Vladivostok one final time before the Burkina Faso contingent returned home, Traoré stood alone on the field where the match had occurred. The snow had been disturbed by 3 days of continued exercises, the pristine white surface now marked with thousands of boot prints, tank treads, and the evidence of ongoing military training. But if he closed his eyes, he could still feel it, that moment when time had seemed to stop, when two philosophies had met on frozen ground, when teaching had been more powerful than defeating. He knelt down, placed his hand on the snow, and whispered, "Thank you, Earth, for holding us. Thank you for teaching us that falling is not failure, that being supported is not weakness, that every ending is a beginning." The wind picked up, carrying his words away into the gathering darkness, spreading them like seeds across the frozen ground. Seeds that might lie dormant through winter, but would bloom when spring finally came. When hearts thawed and understanding could grow. In that moment, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso understood that he hadn't just won a match or taught a lesson. He had planted seeds of a different way of thinking about strength, about power, about what it means to be a warrior in a world that too often confuses violence with courage, aggression with honor, and seeds, he knew, have a way of growing in the most unexpected places, even in frozen ground, even in the coldest winter. You just have to be patient enough to wait for spring. The end.